Well, hello, everybody. You're very welcome to today's Power Hour webinar, which is on the subject of the power of team communication. And our speaker today is faculty member, friend of the show, Neil Curran. And he's going to bring us on the crazy journey that is team communications, the pitfalls, the things you can do to help and improve your team communications and make your workplace a happier place. On our chat function today, we have our colleague Kate McRainer, who's going to be taking care of all your questions. If you have any questions, just pop them into the chat and we'll deal with them at the Q&A section. So Neil, just making sure you can hear me. I haven't been talking into the void there, even though I'm sitting in front of the void.
Loud and clear, Claire, loud and clear.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, everybody has started to come in, so hopefully you've got a cuppa and half a sandwich at least and an open mind, and that's what we need. So without further ado, I'll just hand it over to Neil. Thank you very much, Neil, for joining us today, and do your thing. If you need me, you know where I am.
Great. I'll hit the panic button if we have a problem.
Yeah,
thanks, Claire.
always.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So, as you might expect, we've only got an hour for this webinar, and our topic is the power of team communication. So, it'll be very boring if I have the slides on the whole way through it. So, I'm going to try and keep the slides to a minimum during this, so that we can get maximum bang for our buck for our time we have together. So, a little bit about me. Clearly, I'm an egomaniac because you're looking at me on screen while seeing a photograph of me in the background. So, that's a good prompt to turn me off. So, why am I talking about team communication? So I was promoted to management level very early in my career, and I was identified as a high-performing individual contributor. And I left the office one day with the news I was being promoted, and I landed in a management role without any of the skills or without any of the training, indeed, equipped to move into that space. So I had very much a trial by fire, and that was how a lot of organizations dealt with promotion into management at the time. However, I enjoyed the whole aspect of people management, and at the peak of my career, I was working in the tech sector, and my background was always finance, a career path that found me rather than I found. And at the peak of my career, I was managing global teams in a tech organization in a senior position within the finance organization. What excited me most was less about the finance things and more so the people side, because communication, as we all know, and there's plenty of literature and research to back this up, communication is the key tool, is the key driver for engagement within our teams, particularly in a leadership role. But when you look at the holistic view of a team, how we communicate is an essential part, the most important component of what makes a team effective. So back in the day when I was in that management role, that meant motivating, engaging teams around the world, often behind Zoom in an era when most people weren't familiar with Zoom, working virtually across those boundaries. And nowadays I specialize in the areas of communication and teams. I'm a certified coach with EQI certification as well. And my master's is actually in the area. My master's in training and education. And I wrote my master's paper on using the tool of improv to develop effective teams. Now, you might say, well, what the heck, what does improv got to do with it? And what was going on with that crazy picture that you just showed us? The other feather in my cap, the Batman to the Bruce Wayne, is that I'm a stage performer and I perform improvised theatre and comedy for fun, professionally, in Ireland and abroad. And I had a point in my journey where I realized that the tendencies, the personality traits I was demonstrating in the workplace were very much extrovert tendencies. And a lot of that personality development had actually come from the stage, had come from the work that I was doing on stage. And I went down a rabbit hole and kind of deciphering that even more, realizing that this is not a new concept. And in fact, a lot of organizations, particularly in the US, have been using theater skills and improv skills to develop their teams and organizations over the years. And it's something that's quite new to us here in Ireland and in Europe. So why is that relevant? Well, improv is, to any of you who've ever heard of it, may think of it as a performing art, usually comedy. But really behind it all, improv is a process of communication. when I'm on stage performing with a team of people, keyword there is a team, we don't have a script. So we have to rely on other soft skills to develop the effectiveness of what we're doing to entertain an audience. And that all comes down to collaboration and communication in an environment where there is no script. And that's obviously very relevant to how we engage with ourselves, with our teams in the workplace. So when you think about then our teams at work, I like to think about our teams as a little bit like a jigsaw, except rather than the pieces being made out of plastic or wood, the pieces are made out of plasticine or mala. Whether we're in a leadership role or an individual contributor, there's times as a team we need to know when it's time to lead and when we need to know it's time to support. So it's kind of a give or take with that. And if you have a team of 4 people, that doesn't necessarily mean that each person has the team on the team has 25% of responsibility within that environment. We step up to the plate when needed, we support, we fall back and let others lead whenever those opportunities and moments require us to do so. It's kind of avoiding that whole sense of siloedness within our teams. And that can sometimes be very tricky for us to do as a team. And certainly from a leadership perspective, that can be very challenging as well. I'm sure many of you on the webinar here today have had a variety of different leaders and managers within teams over the years, some who are very open and very engaging as a leader, and some who maybe were more on the scale of on the end of micromanaging and having total control over the work that you're doing, let alone what they're doing, and basically telling us what we should be doing. And we all know how disengaging that can be for us as a team. So at the core of all that then is, using our communication skills, regardless of the role we're in, to get the most out of our team from a productivity perspective and from an engagement perspective as well. But at this point, it's worth mentioning one aspect of developing our teams before we kind of dive deeper into communication, and that is the whole sense of team building. I remember when I was doing my research for my master's and I was looking at the whole area of team effectiveness and the components of that. And team building is something that comes up a lot. And I'm sure these pictures on screen now probably either give you nightmares or happy memories of times you've perhaps done team building with your company's organizations, past or present. And there is a bit of a paradox within that because in a team setting in the workplace, it's very much about collaboration, pulling together, leveraging our strong points, leveraging our communication skills to get the job done. But when we look at team building, as an activity, it usually involves some competitive angle, which can be very counterproductive to the whole concept of team building overall, because we want to be in a space of collaboration when we're developing our teams. So that can actually be disengaging from a team building perspective and can be a reason why a lot of people shy away from it. I remember I read one survey that said 92% of employees feel that team building is an essential part of developing teams at work. And then many of us roll our eyes at the thoughts of having to do team building, and that's probably a reason for it. So when we think then of communication, it's worth pointing out that, communication we know is an essential part of how we engage the workforce, how we engage our teams, how we go about our business and work. But there's many different ways we communicate and many different ways, many different platforms we use, particularly nowadays. We're all on Zoom here. Some of you are probably using Teams, WebEx, things like that. So there's a concept called the communication intimacy pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, we have face-to-face interaction, which I guess is the prime method for interacting, the traditional method for interacting, and I guess the most effective from a certain perspective. And right down the bottom of that communication pyramid, the topic everyone would probably vote for being the least effective, which is email. And I say least effective, the least enjoyed. We all know what email overload can be like. And then in between that, we have everything from video calls, phone calls, and instant messages and chat. The thing about the intimacy pyramid is it's not just highlighting the different ways we can go about communicating at work. It's also highlighting that there's a need to change our approach, whatever platform and whatever method that we're using within that environment. A lot of you are probably still working in a hybrid environment, or maybe you're still more remote than in person. And you probably, and hopefully you did, went through a process post-pandemic to start to define with your teams what that hybrid team environment looks like, be it coming up with a team charter or just really setting down ground rules for how we engage and communicate as a team. And that may involve anchor days. It may involve, defining defining what platform and tools we use. And that's something that's quite essential, that team charting, particularly when it comes to communication, because we want to create an environment. Leaders should want to create an environment where we have healthy, open communication and two-way communication with our teams. And why is that? Well, in an environment where you've got open communication or two-way communication, it's an environment where employees feel safe and confident to be able to speak up and speak out about issues that affects them both with their manager or with their peers. And two-way feedback is where we do that with our manager or direct reports. And that all sounds great in theory, and I'm sure all of us would agree that yes, that is something that's essential in a team. But in practical implementation of it, it's not always easy. Sometimes there's things in work where we just have to communicate, or we feel we just have to tell our teams, this comes from the top. This is how this new process is going to roll out. This is how this new product is going to be rolled out. And we may feel this is black and white, and we don't need to really, there's no point in getting feedback from people. And then what happens there is we become quite selective about how we communicate or how we manage open communication. And that can cause disengagement as a result of that. So if we're really striving to create a positive environment with communication, enhance the communication with our teams, then we have to practice open communication in all aspects. And of course, there's an elephant in the room with that, and that is time and efficiency. Everyone's busy. Leaders and managers are busy. So sometimes looking for that shortcut or that hack when it comes to communication is going to be essential. And that might mean here's a message from the top. I'm just going to forward the email. People can moan if they want over the water cooler, but there's not much I can do about it. And that can send the wrong message to our team. So we have to bear that in mind as leaders. If we're pushing for that power of communication, that open communication, we have to manage it during the times where it's black and white, and during other times when we do feel that it's easier to encourage people to speak up. So when we think of the word communication, though, I often say this to people: communication, it's a bit of a dirty word. What do I mean with that? Well, I'm sure we've all heard in our work lives, and if you're like me, probably in your personal lives as well, we need to communicate better. And you have to ask yourself, well, what does that actually mean? I kind of equate the word communication similar to the word sport. If you know somebody in your life who enjoys sport, who loves sport, and you say, oh, you like sport, and they say, yeah, I love sport. And then you ask them, well, do you like cricket? And they say, well, actually, I don't like cricket. I like other sports. Communication is kind of the same. There's so many different components within that sphere of communication that we have to, or that we want to strive to be able to master, both as leaders and as individual contributors within our teams. And we won't have time today to go through all aspects of that, but I'm going to share some of the ones that we can influence, be it ourselves, whether you're in a leadership position or whether you're an individual within your team, where you can influence and affect change. At the top of of all the different aspects of communication, if we think about communication, all the different ways we communicate, at the top of it all, we really have listening. Listening is the most important skill within that communication hierarchy, because in reality, if we're not able to listen, we're not able to practice active listening, as we often hear, then we're not setting ourselves up for success when it comes to responding. And active listening is all great in theory, but again, that sense of us being busy, being under pressure to get things done, that can become a challenge for us to practice our active listening skills. So what is active listening? Well, active listening is all about listening with intent. It's to listening, completely focusing on what a person is saying and not making any assumptions about it while they're talking. Now, I don't know, Claire, at this point, are we able to maybe get some people from the webinar who might want to participate in exercise to demonstrate that? Is that something we can possibly do?
I think you just stuck with me, Neil. I'm terribly sorry.
I've
Our
stuck your
audience are in the lovely warm position of
there.
being able to sit there
They're like,
and
he can't. Anyone who's worked with me before is like, great, he can't pick on me here. That's okay. That's okay. We'll chime on. We'll chime on without it. So with active listening, and it's a term. It's like when we hear that term, active listening, it means that we must be listening harder than just regular listening. So it's all about paying full attention to the speaker, and that's not something that we do often when we communicate. If I'm talking with Claire, myself and Claire obviously work together, but let's say myself and Claire are friends. We don't work together. I'm not Claire's boss. Claire's not my boss. And we meet up for a coffee. And Claire is talking about a holiday that she's going on this summer. And she tells me, Neil, I've booked a family holiday to Barcelona. And when I get to Barcelona, I'm going to go and cruise around the Mediterranean. What's actually happening from a listening perspective for most people in conversation is while the person is speaking, in our brain, we're not fully paying attention to what they're saying. What our brain is doing is half our brain is focusing on picking out the key words in the conversation to get the gist of what's being spoken about. And the rest of our energy goes into thinking about what we're going to say next. Now we do that in our head, but could you imagine if we did that out loud? Imagine while Claire's telling me about this holiday she's very excited about, and I'm saying out loud, I can't wait till she stops talking so I can tell her about this restaurant in this particular district of Barcelona. Obviously, that would be very, very rude, but that is exactly what's going on in our heads when we're having conversation. And when there's a socially acceptable gap in the dialogue, I will probably jump in then and say, oh, you have to go to this museum, you have to go there. And it becomes a bit of a rinse and repeat process. Now, in that example where you're having a conversation with a friend, the stakes are very low. I don't have to read Claire's body language, the tone of her voice. I'm not trying to impress her. She's not my boss. So it doesn't really matter if I miss out a couple of things in that conversation. That's the way most conversations go. However, within the team environment, that's where things become a little bit different, or in any professional setting, because we have to fully pay attention to what the person is saying. We are going to pick up the nonverbal cues when they're communicating. Now, if you Google the importance of nonverbal communication, there's lots of different statistics on it, and a lot of them get blown out of proportion because context is very important. But we do interpret and pick up things from the nonverbals, whether we're aware of the impact that it has or not. But if we aren't fully paying attention, we're going to miss out on things. Think about a time maybe early in your career when you're a bit green around the ears and maybe you made a mistake and you were trying to communicate that to, your boss and what that was like. Were you 100% fully open with the mistake, or were you trying to come out of it on top? And think about maybe somebody, you've worked with over the years who's been in that position. And, so people can unconsciously maybe communicate something that isn't 100% reflecting of reality. And that's just the nature of how we communicate, particularly verbally. So in that professional context, we want to focus on those nuances of body language, tone, really pay attention to what the person's saying, putting ourselves in their shoes. But there is an elephant in the room with that. And that is, if I'm paying attention to what you're saying and putting myself in your shoes, it means that when you finish saying what you're saying, I aren't going to have thought of what I want to say next. And we will get what the scientists call an awkward pause, something that many people are fearful of. And I guess that's probably another reason why a lot of people, or a lot of us as humans are thinking ahead and thinking of the thoughts of what we want to say next. And when we're doing that, when we have focus on those future thoughts, again, we're not paying attention to the people that we're communicating with. So in that setting, what we can do when we're in an environment where we're communicating with our team and we are encouraging open communication, people to give feedback, people to ask questions. When we have that moment when we're paying attention, putting ourselves in their shoes, and there is an awkward silence incoming because you're not thinking ahead. Very simple way to manage that or get used to that is just thanking people for their input. And that was something I would always encourage within a team setting, particularly when you're having open conversation. Whenever somebody asks a question or whatever somebody gives their input, it's just simply thank them for their contribution. And it gives you a second or two to process your thoughts. And also, if it's a setting where there's nervousness involved, such as giving a presentation or perhaps communicating something difficult to your team within the team, it gives you a chance to kind of keep control of your composure as well and not let nerves get the better of you. And even with that, if you need to add some more or need some more time to process your thoughts, you can simply say, thank you for your comment. Thank you for your question. Let me think about that for a moment. And you're just flagging that you're processing your thoughts. And it eradicates that fear, apprehension we can have around awkward silences. So as I say in the slide here, being present, which is all about that flow. It's all about getting into flow state. Because when we're focused on what somebody is saying, what's being communicated, it means we're not thinking about anything else. We're just purely being in the moment, focusing on that conversation. And of course, listening is one part of it. There's another aspect of listening, separate to active listening, and that's the follow-up. And that's what we call reflective listening. And reflective listening is where you get to probe a little bit deeper to understand what it is that the person is communicating. Because with listening, it's about putting ourselves in the other person's shoes when they're communicating, which means not making assumptions. So we don't want to jump to our own conclusions. So then through reflective listening, where we might summarize or paraphrase back what the person is saying, or maybe maybe ask some open questions to get them to elaborate further, and then reach a point where we can confirm mutual understanding. And that really helps us understand what the person's communicating and getting a sense from where they're coming from. But there is an added bonus with practicing active listening and reflective listening, is that reflective listening, particularly when you put the two of them together, it allows us get to root causes of issues. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, you have a situation where you have somebody in the team who's quite expressive emotionally about something that's bothering them. And you will find that they'll be more vocal about the emotional aspect and frustration or whatever the emotion may be, rather than communicating clearly what the core issue is. So when communicating with somebody like that, if you're practicing your active and reflective listening, that probing technique, after you've actively listened to what they're saying, using that probing technique or probing questions allows you to drill a little bit deeper, peel the layers off the onion, and get a clearer understanding of what that person is actually saying. And that can be used to great effect. But it really, again, it comes back to that point I made about time and efficiency. It means that we have to spend a little bit more time to allow conversations to flourish, to allow discussions to flourish, and really give people the space to be able to speak up and process thoughts. Now, usually, as I kind of hinted at with Claire, there's an exercise I could do to kind of share what that feeling is like when we're truly active listening. But this is just something you can put in practice with yourselves, with your teams, is just really focusing what other people are saying, processing thoughts, and then asking questions to clarify before you give your response. And for those of you who are in a setting where you may be in a setting where there's a bit of a challenge, perhaps you're nervous or anxious about the communication, as I said, like a presentation and things like that. All of these kind of tips and concepts sound great on paper, but we all know that feeling of, gosh, I have to give this news within the team, to communicate this within the team. It's not going to go down well. And those feelings can become dominant in their head. They can almost become overwhelming. And when people are then speaking up or speaking out, what's going through our head is the oh God moments, the oh no moments when people are giving negative comments or giving criticism. And that again takes us away from truly active listening or reflective listening. So it does take a bit of practice to do that. But just knowing that we don't have to race out with our answers, we don't have to respond immediately when somebody speaks, and giving ourselves the time to be able to process our thoughts can be very helpful as part of that. So that's just a little bit on the whole concept of active listening and reflective listening. So we're all master listeners now. So how might we approach other aspects in communicating? So there's a concept that I talk about, which is all about conscious communication. So what do I mean by conscious communication? So in the spoken format, the way when we speak to our team, when we speak to colleagues, we do it unconsciously, meaning that we have a thought in our head. I want to communicate that within the team. And the signal goes from that part of the brain where the thought is formed to where the part of the brain where words and dialogue are formed. And I will blurt out what I'm saying. And generally speaking, most of the time, we don't necessarily think about the communication needs of the people we're communicating with when we do so. Everybody perceives and interprets the world differently. So there's a filters that goes through. So if you think about it, you're the sender of a message. That connection, electrical connection happens in your brain between where the thought is and between where you're forming your words. And that meaning is then communicated as you speak. And that goes through a great filter with the people you're speaking to within your team. And that filter is called perception. And perception is influenced by what the people you're communicating with think of the topic, think of you, how busy they are, language barriers, cultural differences, all those things. And once that message has gone through that filter, it will result in their understanding. And as we all know, the meaning you have in the message that you communicate doesn't always result in the understanding of the people you're communicating with. And that causes miscommunications and the likes. Now, when we're communicating in written format, we probably put a little bit more thought into the words that we use when we're communicating. I can remember early in my career one day trying to tell my boss I couldn't make it to a meeting in the US because I was taking time off, and I deliberated over an email for most of the day, just thesaurusing it and word picking the words to use, when in reality, what I said didn't really matter. It was just about communicating. I wouldn't be at the meeting, but I was laboring over the words I should use around it. Total waste of time. We don't do that when we're communicating in person or face to face. So when we think about conscious communication, it's all about communicating with intention, putting ourselves in the shoes of the people we're communicating with and asking what do they need from a communication perspective. And I'll share a very quick story on this about how I used it. I remember one company I was with, we were going through a restructure, and leadership management was asked to communicate to your teams, there is a restructure, but our jobs within our department were unaffected and it was business as usual. So a very, very simple message, and we were asked to communicate with our teams. The nature of the teams I had at the time meant they were in different regions, different time zones. So it meant I had to set up a number of different meetings with the teams rather than just one big team meeting. So with the local team in the office, it was very simple. I called them into the office. The meeting was over in less than 5 minutes. This is what's happening. There wasn't any questions, and when they got on with it. Obviously, there was a stronger relationship there because we would have the informal relationship. We would have the coffees, the lunches and that. So we had that informal relationship that was stronger. But for teams where I was communicating with them virtually pretty much all year round, I was very conscious of, how they might perceive the message. And I remember one team in particular, I actually put a few slides together on the topic because I was aware of their communication needs. They were sensitive to organizational change where they didn't have that same rapport with me as their manager because of that. Most of our communication was formal because we're communicating virtually. So I put a couple of slides together, and that communication with them was about 30, 40 minutes because they had lots of questions. And that was a communication that was happening virtually. So what I didn't want to happen was communicate the message, think that I've gotten my point across, and then hang up from the virtual meeting and have them thinking, oh, Neil didn't say this or Neil didn't say that. So it was very important that when I finished that meeting that they had all their questions asked and all their questions answered. So while the message was the same from the top, how that was delivered to those themes was different in each case. So that's just an example of using conscious communication in action. But to kind of break it down a little bit further, unfortunately, I'm not allowed to get those of you who are attending to participate in this, but I have a worthy volunteer who is going to help me out this, which is Claire. So Claire, if you would join me on screen, we're gonna do an exercise in this conscious communication, and this is going to sound like a magic show. Claire has no idea what we're going to be doing. I haven't given her any prep for this exercise because this is a self-awareness exercise. So you watching this in the webinar will have the benefit of hearing Claire's feedback, Claire's observations on her interaction. So there's going to be 3 stages to this interaction, Claire. It's going to be a very, very simple interaction. We're coming up to the May bank holiday. So I've themed this interaction around holidays. So in this interaction, we are going to have a discussion about a holiday. I will start the discussion, Claire, by saying, let's plan a holiday. And you're going to respond to me saying, no, I don't want to plan a holiday because, and then you're going to tell me why you don't want to plan a holiday. And then you might suggest something different instead of doing the holiday. So you might say, no, I don't want to plan a holiday because Irish Times training won't give me any more time off this year. Instead of that, let's go to Marley Park instead. And then I will respond to that by saying, no, I don't want to because let's do something different. So we'll have a little bit of back and forth in this. Obviously, we're not going to go on holiday. But what I would ask those of you viewing to watch out for is just seeing, if you notice anything in the interaction in terms of our behaviors more so than the script that we're using. So that sound okay, Claire? Do you think we can
Oh,
manage
yeah,
this?
no
Here we
problem.
go. Don't forget, we're live on TV here. We're
I
live on
know.
TV. Off we go. So Claire, let's plan a holiday.
No, I don't want to because I want to save for a car, actually. I think it's more important. It's more practical. Don't want to, just throw money away on a holiday that I'll forget.
And what would you like to do
But
instead?
let's instead, why don't we do that adventure weekend that we were going to do? It'll only take a couple of days and we can get out in nature.
No, I don't want to do that, Claire, because I hate physical activities that involve going
Mhm.
outdoors. Instead, let's go to the cinema.
Okay, or maybe not. How about let's go to that lovely restaurant we've been talking about because it's really nice, and I'd say we'd get a really good table over the weekend.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Claire. A virtual round of applause for you there, Claire.
Oh,
In the instruction for that exercise, you will note that the script very much said, no, stay on screen, Claire, because I'm going to ask you some questions now, if you're okay with that. So in the exercise, you saw there was a script that said, no, I don't want to do that because instead, let's do this. It only took till the second time we did the exercise before Claire physically stopped saying, no, I don't want to do that. Were you aware that you changed the script, Claire?
no.
No. So what Claire actually said was maybe not. And, to the casual observer, you might say, what's the big deal? She was still saying no. The intention behind her message was no. I'm sorry to be talking about you now in the third person like this,
All
Claire.
right.
The intention behind what Claire was saying was no, but the word she used was maybe not. And maybe not isn't a strict no. Now, in the setup for the exercise, we have a big dirty no. And from a cultural perspective, as any Irish people who are dialed in will know, there's no Irish word for no and there's no Irish word for yes. So we are very much, from a cultural perspective, Irish people and British people as well, we would have an indirect culture. We beat around the bush, as one participant in a workshop once told me. Irish people use very fluffy language when we communicate. So saying no can be actually very challenging for a lot of us. And we saw in that example, Claire, on the second iteration, dropped the no completely. Now, her intention was that she was saying no, but when she introduced that maybe not, it was almost softer. So it's almost like she's trying to say she's pained in saying no to me, so she softens the blow. And we do this a lot in Irish culture when we're communicating, and we do this a lot professionally. It's very much a cultural thing. Now, if you think about anyone who's in a multinational or has international people within your teams, think about people who come from direct cultures, like say Italians, Spanish people, French people, Germans. They're very direct in how they communicate. Eastern Europeans, the same, very direct in how they communicate. And to Irish people, I mean, you think about your first time encountering people abroad, perhaps on holiday, and you might say, "Gosh, German people, Italian people, they're very rude the way they speak. They're very rude, that directness." But that's completely normal and natural. But even within the context of the four walls of Ireland, how someone from Dublin culturally might communicate with somebody in Cork or Kerry could be very different from a cultural perspective. So culture isn't just reserved for from a national perspective. Now, you also notice as well in the exercise, I gave Claire the instruction of saying, instead of that, let's do this. And this kind of falls into the same category. That statement, let's do this, or let's do whatever we're going to do. Again, that's a very assertive statement. And that's something that doesn't fall naturally to us. Now, we're going to see that in action again, though. I'm going to get Claire back in the spotlight, Claire. We're going to try the exercise again, except this time we're going to change the script slightly. She's going to be very keen now to make sure she doesn't change the script with this now. Uh, so with this time, we'll try it on the holiday, Claire, but this time I'd like you to say, yes, I'd love to plan a holiday, but, and then say your excuse and suggest something different. So let's see what happens this time round. Oh, sorry. Yeah, let's plan a
Go
holiday.
for it. I'd love to, but I'm hopeless at this. But I really need to save my money for that car that I've been, looking at. How about we go on oh God, damn it, I've done it already. Instead, let's go for that long weekend we've been planning for the last 4 years.
Oh, yes, I'd love to go on that long weekend we've been planning for the last 4 years, but I'm very busy with a sporting event this weekend. Let's go for a pint on Friday instead.
I'd love to, but I'm on the drive for May just for the crack because I'm trying to lose a few pounds. So instead, let's go to a vegan restaurant where we won't eat
Great.
much.
And another virtual round of applause for Claire there for doing a magnificent job. Now, what was interesting there, you'll notice that Claire caught herself when she did that because the instruction was, let's do this instead. And can you remember what you said, Claire, when you were answering that?
Not a clue. I have
I,
no recollection whatsoever.
I'm probably going to misquote it now, and somebody will be watching and say, "No, I'll rewind back the
Oh,
video now." And I'll
I
tell.
caught myself.
So you caught yourself, and I think you said maybe we could do this instead. So again, that assertive statement of let's go away for a weekend. It's a very assertive statement. It's not asking someone a question. It's telling somebody this is what we're going to do. But it's not something that's very natural for us, particularly in Irish culture. So we often say things like, maybe we could do this. How about we do this? We could do this. And there's actually a term for that. It's called auxiliary language. We call that auxiliary language. When we use words like should, would, could, maybe, perhaps, why don't we? That's actually called auxiliary language. And that is basically non-committal language. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say Claire is my boss and I'm due to give, and I'm a new hire. I'm due to give Claire a report that's very important today. And I say, Claire, you're looking at that for that report. No problem. I should have that report on your desk by 5 o'clock today. Claire doesn't get that report. She's having coffee with Dave McGee tomorrow morning and she says, Dave, I really regret hiring that Neil fella. He's very flaky. He promised me he'd get me that report and he never did. Now, I didn't say I promise. I said I should. And it's a non-committal statement. We use it a lot unconsciously and it's basically us saying, I'm not sure if I can do this on time. And we use that kind of language all the time. And we often filter out the auxiliary words when we do so. And it's something that's very rife from an Irish culture perspective as well. I have a Spanish friend and And I remember talking to him once. We were making plans for a trip one time, and I was using a lot of should and yes, I'd love to. When I was saying, I remember one time he asked me about visiting some museum, and I said, yeah, that's yeah, I'd love to do that, but maybe we could do that on a different day or something to that effect. And he asked me afterwards, so are you saying yes, you can do it, or no, you can't do it? So, that use of auxiliary language, while to a certain extent in casual conversation, we absorb it and it doesn't make too much difference. In a professional context, it can really result in a completely different understanding, particularly if you're talking to people who come from a direct culture. So again, if when you think about this and stepping back from it, you got to ask yourself, what's most naturally and what's the most natural way to communicate for me, and not to keep laboring what Claire did. She's been a star so far with her acting skills. You'll notice again in the script said yes, I'd love to, but Claire actually didn't use the word yes from the script when she answered like that. Now I'm not going to put Claire on the spot and ask why, but for a lot of people that can be almost like an inner guilt. I'm not really saying yes to this, so I'm actually going to stop saying the word yes. It's almost like a guilt. Some people have said to me that when we say but in the sentence, or sorry, I think it was Mark Twain said, when we say but in the sentence, you can ignore everything the person has said up to that point because it's probably a lie. Some people say that when we say yes, I'd love to, but we are saying no, but it gives a sense of hope, whereas other people feel that it's very inauthentic and disingenuous to do that. So we're going to try one last part of the exercise, Claire. You'll be glad to know that you'll get the Oscar straight afterwards. And this is the easy part of the exercise because there's less words to remember. So
Okay.
this time we're going to use the response yes and, or you can say yes, let's. So Claire, let's plan a holiday.
Yes, and let's go to that place that we've been talking about for hundreds of years and we haven't gotten ourselves together to do it. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes, let's fly to Sicily and let's use the Irish Times corporate credit card to pay for the whole trip. So
Excellent. Thanks a million. I can't
great.
wait.
That's all she needed to hear. So obviously we would go on to have a very different conversation this time, a very unrealistic and expensive holiday. But there is method to the madness here. So I won't put Claire on the spot, but if you all kind of reflect on the three stages of that exercise, and thank you, Claire, for your acting skills and that, very much appreciated. But if we reflect on the three stages that exercise, we started with a hard no because we had this point of yes, but, and then we had a yes and. So imagine that that's a scale. At a scale with the no on the left, the yes on the right, and the yes but in the middle. If you were to really reflect and think about how you communicate and ask yourself, if I was to plot myself on that scale, where would I land? And you'll probably find that most people, particularly from a cultural perspective in Ireland and the UK, most people will be either slightly left or slightly right of yes, but. Now, you will get exceptions. Perhaps if you work in where you have a legal background, a financial background, roles that would be considered gatekeepers or, protectors of company assets or what have you, you might find you're more towards no because that's your job. Or if you're in, say, a sales role or a client facing role, you might find you're closer to the yes and. There may be those nuances, but generally speaking, most of us fall either left or right of the yes but. And the reason why it's important to highlight that is because if that's where we're most comfortable, or that's where our default is, well, then that tells us something about our mindset when we communicate. What's interesting, I won't put Claire on the spot, but when we do this exercise with people and with teams, and I ask them, how was their listening skills during it? A lot of people will say that it's only when they were using the yes and response that they were really listening to what the other person was saying, because there's a part of them, I guess, that are thinking, God, I'm saying yes to this. I better listen to what I'm signing up for. Whereas with the no and the yes, but you're not agreeing to what the person is saying. So you're maybe not engaging and listening at a level that is necessary for the conversation. So because we can become aware of where our default is and where our default responses is, it can highlight how we may not be listening at an effective level within our teams, but also how we can stifle communication within our teams as well. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to put myself in the docs now, and to give a chance for Claire's revenge here, I'll tell a story about myself. So I was managing a team some years ago, and I had an individual who requested time off. And what was unique about this request was that he was looking for unpaid leave, an extended period of unpaid leave, and it was going to clash with our quarter end activities. It was a finance role, so we had quarter end responsibilities. We weren't permitted to take time off at our quarter end period, but we also didn't have a policy about unpaid leave. The individual had booked holidays and vacation for the year, wasn't willing to cancel any of them. He wanted to take this additional unpaid leave. And it was for religious reasons. He was very spiritual. He was a practicing Buddhist. And this was something something that was very, very important to him. As he was making this request to me, he took a great deal of time to explain his request to me. And despite me sharing all this wonderful stuff about conscious communication with you today, when he was saying this to me, in my head, I was coming up with detailed lists as to why he couldn't just take this time off before he had finished speaking. So, in what was actually happening was I was defaulting to that position of yes, but. And my brain was teeing itself up to say, yes, I'd love to give you the time off. It sounds amazing, but, and then listing all those reasons. And I had to catch myself and stop myself from doing that. It probably would have been okay to do that, to say, I mean, I imagine because of the nature of making the request, you probably had an expectation this probably may not get approved. But from my perspective as the manager in that setting, I was defaulting to saying yes, but without really fully listening. I was coming up with the reasons why he couldn't do it before he had fully spoken. Instead, what I did was I said, leave it with me. And instead of coming up with all the reasons why I couldn't do it, I challenged myself. I challenged myself to take on a yes and mindset, which basically meant not just saying yes, but it meant saying to myself, what do I need to do to make this happen? So rather than taking the negative view of coming up with the reasons why I can't do it, come up with all the things that I need to do to make this happen. So in the end, I'll cut a long story short, he did actually get the unpaid leave off because that exercise was a due diligence. What do I need to do as a leader to enable this? Which involved me doing a bit of work around automation, around upskilling other people on the team to cover his responsibilities. And I'm not going to lie, it was a labor of pain to do that. It would have been far easier, far efficient to just say no. And I know he would have accepted that. He probably wouldn't have been happy. But there was a huge benefit in me saying yes to it, having done that due diligence. First of all, it highlighted there was clearly a gap here. I had to upskill people on my team to cover important responsibilities when people are out of the office. But it also showed that, I was putting myself in the team member's shoes and thinking about it from his perspective. From his perspective, his loyalty within the organization, within the team grew enormously. He really felt like this was a time that the manager walked the talk, that the manager really did consider something that was out of the norm and putting himself in the employee's shoes. So his loyalty after that, engagement within the team and productivity grew as a result of that. And that's just one anecdotal story, but there's a lot more research and literature on this out there. I'm happy to share with people afterwards. But really, from your perspective, what we need to be thinking about is, where do I plot myself on that conscious communication scale? Am I more towards no, more towards yes, or am I most likely somewhere in the yes but? And asking ourselves, when we're communicating, is this the appropriate response or is it the default response? So just to close out with some points around that. So our words influence the receiver's interpretation and perception of meaning. So in other words, put yourself in the shoes of the people you're communicating with in the team and asking yourself, what are their communication needs? We need to be mindful of our default responses and the language we use. So is no because appropriate? Is yes but appropriate? Is yes and appropriate? And yes and doesn't mean literally saying yes. It's just asking ourselves, what do I need to do to make this happen? We need to avoid auxiliary language as well. So watching out for that should, would, and could. And also being mindful of how culture influences the way we communicate. Now, culture in its own right, we could do a webinar, we can actually do a week's training on the whole aspect of culture and communication, but just to share some highlights from how culture influences and affects us. I'll switch off the slides for this. So I mentioned about communicating with a Spanish person earlier. So there is a hypothesis in language called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which asks the question, does language influence thought or thought influence language? And the research has shown that actually, from a certain perspective and in a lot of ways, the way we speak influences the way we think. So think of it like this. If anyone here speaks a European language, another European language, I speak a bit of Spanish. When I was learning Spanish, one of the first things you learn in any language is how to order a coffee or a sandwich. And translated into English, how you ask for a coffee in Spanish, you say, I want a coffee or I need a coffee. And when I was learning Spanish, I asked the teacher and I said, yeah, but how do you really ask for coffee? And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, no one walks into a coffee shop and says, I want a coffee or I need a coffee. Because in Ireland, we say, when you have a moment there, if you're not too busy, could I trouble you when you have a chance for a coffee? We would use that indirect, fluffy language, as someone once said to me, to make our request. And that was something that the teacher laughed at because the simple way is they're just saying, I want a coffee or I need a coffee. There's no rudeness about it. It's direct and to the point. But to an Irish person, that would seem quite rude. Try that in your canteens now tomorrow when you go back to work, asking for a coffee as direct like that and see how it goes down. So, and then looking, without getting too much more detail to it, if that's the way somebody is used to speaking, then how does that influence the way they think? So you will get a lot of direct communication As a result of that, you'll get more to the point, a lot more assertiveness. And then when indirect and direct culture meets from a communication perspective, that's when we can have personality clashes. That's where we can have miscommunication, things like that as a result of it. Now, that's just one example of how culture influences. There's other ways when it comes how language affects us when it comes to blame and things like that. So that's something else we have to be mindful of. Just to kind of share that with you, if anyone, if when you think about blame and how we communicate in the English language, if ever there's an accident, we usually apportion a person's name to the accident. So if I'm in the Irish Times office having coffee with Claire and I spill my coffee all over the floor and Dave comes in and says, what happens to the floor? It's natural that somebody would say Neil spilled the coffee on the floor, even though it was an accident. But in other languages where it is an accident, the blame isn't apportioned to the person. It translated to English, it often the response is the coffee spilled. And when you dive into that and look at, well, how does that affect the way we communicate and the way we think? It means that for native English speakers, it means that that's why, blame becomes very important, or becomes a highlight when we're communicating, particularly when this mistake has been made. And when you think about cultures within teams of mistakes, what do we do when people on our team make mistakes? How do we encourage learning from that? If we are driven by that sense of blame and how we communicate, that can have a detrimental effect when there are challenges and problems that people face. But like I say, that whole aspect, that whole concept is a webinar in its own right. But just to share those nuances with you. So really what I'm getting to with all this, to wrap it up, is just drawing awareness to how you communicate within your team and how you communicate with others. How thinking about the language you use by default when you're communicating and trying to understand the impact that it has. If you're using auxiliary language, it's non-committal language. So if you want to practice being more assertive, we really might need to change the script that you use when you're communicating. And also that default mindset piece. If you're in a leadership position, a management position, listening to that, this is the extra value add for you, is seeing how you can encourage more of that open communication as a result of that, while being mindful of the language you use as a leader within the team. There is I'm sure many of you come across the DISC model of communication styles before. I'm not going to go into it here today. It's highly Googleable, but that's a tool that's very, very useful to use within teams to get a sense of everyone's communication style and the nuances within that in terms of people's communication needs. And that can be a very, very helpful way within teams to kind of encourage more positive and open communication and really create that safe space to help create that safe space for people to speak up and speak out. Now, I feel I've spoken a million words a minute, but it looks like I'm coming in on time to allow for Q&A. So thank you all for listening. Hopefully you are still listening and the participant count hasn't dropped to 10. But if anyone has any questions or comments, I'll be happy to field the easy ones anyway. Isn't that what we say, Claire? We'll field the easy
Yeah,
ones.
we're just going to go for the easy ones.
Just the easy ones.
I don't know about that now, because Inez is Spanish and she said when she asks for a coffee, she says a coffee, please, which
There
sounds
you go.
wonderful to me.
There you go.
And then also on the national cultural spectrum, an Irishman, Dave, has said that the Irish are speaking like an apologetic language. So Inez is very straight, whereas I would be asking terribly sorry to, take time out of your day, Mr. Coffee Man, but can I have a coffee? So
that's very true.
I'm wasting my word count.
That's very true, because when, think about the time you bumped into somebody in the street by accident, we always say sorry, even if the person bumped into us. Whereas in other cultures, it's excuse me. We don't really say excuse me. We tend to say sorry. So we are very apologetic
Yeah,
from a
we
cultural
are.
perspective.
But it's a mindset, and it's something that we can tweak,
Yes,
taking
absolutely.
particular note of my Oscar-winning performance there. Thanks very
Absolutely.
much. I didn't know that was going to happen. So some other questions that have come up. Halle has asked, is there an example of, and I know that we're kind of tight for time, but I just want to make sure that we kind of get as many in as we can. Is there another example of yes and where we're trying to decline a request?
Yeah. So it's all about yes. So it's how do we use yes and when we want to say no? I actually worked with a client on this in the past. So it comes back to the assertiveness of the language. So the yes and mindset is that how do I make this happen? But as I spoke about there, when we are in that mindset, it means we're listening harder. We're practicing our active listening when communicating with whoever we're communicating. It's all well and good being more assertive with our no's, but we also have to bear in mind that when we are giving the hard no or the yes, but we may not be fully listening to what the person is saying. But ultimately, it comes down to the assertiveness of the language that we're using. think about your own organization. If you went up to someone in the legal department and asked them, "Am I able to do X, Y, and Z?" And if it's illegal or if it goes against policies or guidelines, the legal person isn't going to beat around the bush. They're just going to say, "No, it's not possible to do that because of policy A, policy B." They're not going to mince their words around it. But depending on the roles we're in, we might, if you're client facing, we will probably mince our words when it comes to being more assertive to, saying no to things. So it's really about reflecting on what's the language I'm defaulting to, and what's the language that's best assertive for me me saying no. I always do say, if you are saying no to things, ask yourself, have I fully listened to the request, put myself in that person's shoes, and then my explanation afterwards where appropriate. Does it need to be short, concise, and to the point, or do I have to spend a bit of time elaborating? Now, there's pros and cons to each of those. I won't go into too much detail, but there are pros and cons. If we're long-winded, it could come across as defensive and waffly, or it could come across that you're taking the time to explain the issue. So you got to, again, put yourself in the shoes of the people who are making the request. I know that's not a silver bullet answer, but hopefully gives some sense.
I think, yeah, there's a lot of sense there, and it's similar to a comment that Susan put in the chat. Thanking people, sorry, when for their contribution can sound like we're actually dismissing them. It's like, thanks very much for that. But because perception is everything, what she prefers to do is say, that's an interesting observation, let me think about it, is more positive rather than thanks very much for. I presume that the context is important, but perception is
Yeah,
something we have to
yeah,
be
no,
aware of what people
yeah.
are perceiving. Yeah.
Perception's reality, and context is obviously important in any scenarios. But ultimately, sorry, I didn't catch the name, but what that person said,
Susan.
it's
Yeah.
it's this Susan, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of the same point. It's acknowledging what they're saying, which gives you time to kind of process your thoughts and think about your response as well. In media and interview, the equivalent of it is, "Oh, that's a great question," and that's another way that people do it. So the outcome is still the same.
Exactly. And then on a tough question actually from Lynn, who has asked, how do you deal with a manager who doesn't listen, who winds up meetings when they finish their agenda and doesn't allow people to speak? So it sounds like it's all transmission and no reception in that particular situation.
Right. So this is a lot. It's a big question, and context is important here. So we don't know who you're talking
Yeah.
about. It's incredibly difficult. If you have somebody who doesn't listen, it's incredibly difficult. What is useful is understanding what their communication style is. So if you look at DISC communication styles, trying to understand, with DISC, what's their communication style, what's their communication needs, and identifying the best way to get through to them. So, for example, if you have somebody, and just taking the conscientious communication style from DISC, people who are very analytical, they're probably somebody who could do with a very detailed email outlining, what the issue is, or what the problem is, or what needs to be done, more so than saying it in person. Now, it's a very simplistic example that I'm using there. But if you have somebody who isn't listening, that's a very, very difficult thing to do, and you have to really reflect, what does that person need? Try that approach, change the approach, obviously, that you're currently using, try that approach. And if that doesn't work, you might need to go over that person's head. But I didn't tell you to do that.
And we all love doing that, don't we? We do.
Me too.
We could go on, like you say, you could do a webinar on like the 4 different sections of the topic that you've brought up, but we just don't have time at the minute. And I know that we've got loads of chat going on in the chat function, which is great. So that just shows that we could actually keep chatting amongst ourselves and try and work things out. I think that the manager who doesn't listen seems to be getting a bit of a
We'll do a
lift.
case study on that.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Maybe they should come and join us for a communication, course. We have loads of those.
there you
And
go.
speaking of which, Neil, I think you've got a few extra slides there. If you don't mind just going back to your desk, your deck there for a second.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Little bit of promotion. I want to say thank you so much to everybody who's been here. It's been a great experience, and I love seeing all the chat, because that just means like we've got loads and loads to talk to you about. Keep an eye out for the next in the series in June is the power of sustainability. So something a little bit less based on one-to-one communication, but obviously based on something that's very important to business and environment and ESG and CSR and all that kind of stuff. So We'll have more details on that, so watch out for those details in your inbox because we will be letting you know about it. I want to say huge thanks to Neil for the improv. That was very unexpected, but obviously enjoyable, and for sharing some of his insights. Neil is one of our faculty, so you can expect to see him possibly at a training session near you. I want to say huge thanks to Kate as well for taking care of the chat function, to everyone for being here. We really do appreciate it. And we hope to see you at another one of our sessions later on in the year. Like I say, in June, we'll have the sustainability session. And then later in the year, we'll have some more. So thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your lunch. Have a lovely long weekend. And Neil, enjoy your holiday. Thanks a million.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Claire.
Bye.
Cheers.